Marshall Billingslea is a former Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. He was in Trump administration appointed as former Special Presidential Envoy for Arms Control at the U.S. Department of State. He previously, along that, served as a U.S. Senate staffer and as a Department of Defense official. He is now a senior fellow in Hudson Institute. Marshall Billingslea, you are most welcome. We are delighted to have you on our show. You are former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Terrorist Financing. Welcome again.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, what is the difference between the Trump administration fighting terrorism financing and the Biden administration doing this act?
Well, I think there's a big difference, and it comes down to a willingness to enforce our sanctions laws and a willingness to be firm in applying pressure on these terror groups and on the world's foremost sponsor of terrorism, which is Iran. Under the Trump administration, there was a very active effort to dry up the funds that Iran was using to sponsor terrorism. That effort has largely gone away, unfortunately, under the Biden administration. And we see the Biden administration now allowing the Iranians to re-enter the global economy. The Iranians are exporting, the latest estimate is up to 1 million barrels of oil a day. And that money will go to destabilize the region, and it will go to terrorist proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas and other groups, the Houthis, in the region.
In November 2017, you testified before Congress on the global implications of the financing of terrorism. You know lots of secrets. Can you tell us how Iran finances its proxy wars?
Iran takes money directly away from the Iranian people, the regime, out of the economy, and ships that money in cash to these terror groups. They also supply weaponry, such as unmanned aerial vehicles and ballistic missiles to countries to groups like the Houthis and Hezbollah, and they provide trainers and assist in developing the ability to conduct terror attacks, and they do this around the world. The Iranians were directly involved, for instance, in the Hezbollah terrorist attacks in Argentina, the EMEA bombings, which killed over 80 people in the worst single terror attack in Latin America. So we see Iranian fingerprints all over the world when it comes to violence against innocent men, women, and children. How
the Americans administration can stop this smuggling or this spreading of money, or how Iran operates? So do you have any details on any operation that you could prevent it before it happens?
There are a number of things that the U.S. was doing under the Trump administration and needs to continue to do under the Biden administration to stop the flow of terrorist financing and to disrupt the conduct of terrorist attacks. First of all, you have to get to the financiers. You have to identify who they are, and you have to take every step necessary to drive them out of the international financial system. And these are fundraisers. These are, in some cases, so-called businessmen. And in other cases, they are directly employed by the Iranian regime to spread money around. Secondly, you have to take military action to interdict shipments illegal shipments of oil, for instance. And in some cases, you need to take the steps that we took against Qasem Soleimani. There have to be consequences for the efforts and the plotting and the planning to kill Americans and to kill our friends and our allies.
During the same congressional testimony, you also spoke about Hezbollah, how Hezbollah operate financially, and can you tell us more detail about your action against it?
Yes, we had Hezbollah in a chokehold financially. Hassan Nasrallah was struggling to raise money He started going on television, doing telethons to raise money. He admitted that what the U.S. Treasury was doing during my time was having a significant effect on him. And we were doing this both by applying pressure directly to the Hezbollah financial network around the world, as well as because of the efforts, successful efforts that we had to dry up Iranian oil exports and to have an effect on the Iranian economy. Hezbollah has a very sophisticated money-raising apparatus. It's not just based in Lebanon, and it's not just dependent upon the Iranians. There are large Hezbollah-supporting communities in the diaspora around the world who provide money back to Lebanon, particularly out of Latin America, but also here in the United States. And Hezbollah uses those funds to do the kinds of destabilizing activities that we even saw just in the last few days.
Can you tell us about money laundering in Latin America, illegal trading, tobacco, drugs? What did you do about it?
We worked very closely with a number of Latin American countries, with the Colombians, with the Argentinians, the Paraguayans. In fact, the Paraguayans took a very important step just a few weeks ago by arresting and hopefully will soon extradite Qasim Hijazi, who is believed to be a Hezbollah financier, but is...
He was captured.
Correct, and sanctioned by the Treasury. Hijazi is a good example of the kind of money laundering that occurs in the tri-border area between Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. Unfortunately, with changes in the Argentinian government, we've seen, I think, a reduction in our ability to collaborate so closely with them because of Christina Kirchner's relationship with the Iranians in particular. So that should be a big concern to us. Also of great concern.
Christina is also in the...
she's the vice president of Argentina now. But she has a very questionable relationship with the Iranians. Even worse is what Nicolas Maduro is doing in Venezuela. And he has opened the door not just to Hezbollah but to the Iranians, and that's going to be very problematic.
You were interviewed last month at the Hudson Institute. During that interview, you warned against Taliban. Do you think that Taliban has tied to a global network of terror financing?
Yeah, absolutely, because the Taliban is directly connected to the Haqqanis, and the Haqqanis are part of the Al-Qaeda network around the world. I think it should be of concern to all citizens what has happened under the Biden administration. If you just compare when Joe Biden was vice president of the United States, he and Obama allowed Daesh to take over and create the ISIS caliphate. And that became a center of terrorism, a territory the size of the state of Indiana. At the very top of that time, Daesh was generating about $2 billion a year, mostly through oil, extortion, and so on. Under Biden now as president, he's allowed the Islamic Emirate to be created across a country the size of Texas. And already at the start of this, the Taliban was making $1.5 billion a year or more, in this case not from oil, but from copper exports, illegal copper exports, a lot of money from drug production, from heroin and from methamphetamine production, and then the typical terrorist extortion and blackmail of innocent populations. So that we're in a very dangerous situation now with the Haqqanis and Al-Qaeda back in Afghanistan and free to plot and free to plan.
So there is more fear from domestic sources of financing terrorism inside the USA?
It's something we have to continually keep an eye on, because we have found over the years, I'll give you Hezbollah as an example, there have been many instances where we have found Hezbollah running financial operations in the United States.
We know names, we know the listing and the sanctions on some entities, but can you tell us?
Well, one of the schemes involved a cigarette trade that was disrupted maybe 7 or 8 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. Another more recent scheme involved trade-based money laundering out of Detroit with used cars. And so this is something that, unfortunately, it does happen in the United States. It happens in every country, or nearly every country. But really the question is whether the government in that country is committed to fighting terrorist financing, working with its friends and its allies. We obviously are, and we have a lot of good partners around the world who also feel likewise.
We will talk about the allies. Let me go back to 2019. You spoke at the United Nations Security Council open debate on how terrorism can cause instability in many regions after 11 September. The Department of Treasury focused on Pakistan, the system known as Hawala. What is the status on Pakistan right now fighting terrorism financing?
So Hawaladars are not just limited to Pakistan. But we've made great progress through the Financial Action Task Force to establish the standard that hawalas are not to be accepted or agreed as part of the international financial system. Countries need to continue to discourage this kind of practice because it is directly used for illicit purposes. Pakistan struggles with its anti-money laundering and its the financing of terrorism programs. Pakistan has long been viewed by the Financial Action Task Force as largely ineffective in stopping key activities within its territory that are used to both raise and finance terror groups. As we've seen recently with overt Pakistani support for the Taliban, it's clear why they have such a problem, because a large segment of their intelligence apparatus is not focused on fighting the financing of terrorism, they're focused on financing terrorism. And that is why the Pakistani government struggles in this area and remains under the close supervision of the Financial Action Task Force and remains at risk of being put on the blacklist if it doesn't clean up its act.
Let's talk about Erdogan. Is he involved in financing terrorist groups?
The Turks are very complicated in their relationship with the United States and how they work with us in some cases and in other cases don't work well with us at all. There have been troubling rumors regarding the president's involvement in certain activities, but I wouldn't want to speculate other than to say that when we talk about Daesh in particular, which is a terror organization that continues to exist, they are gaining strength in Afghanistan, and they continue to raise money through their different affiliated groups in Africa and elsewhere, Asia. Turkey is a center for Daesh terrorist financing. There are many individuals who are in Turkey who are involved in Hawala type activities, moving money around the world for terrorist attacks. And we very much need the Turkish government to take better and more forceful action to stop this.
To cooperate.
And they do cooperate, but it's insufficient.
What about the cooperation with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates? We know that they are advanced, especially UAE. They announced recently 150 entities under, they track them and they put them under sanctions.
I'll tell you, really one of the great privileges was working with the Saudi Arabian government. They are outstanding partners in the fight against terrorism and in the fight against terrorist financing. The UAE is also a very strong partner, and they have taken a number of very effective steps. The situation in the Emirates is more complicated than it is in Saudi Arabia, both because you have multiple emirates with different legal authorities and jurisdictions. You also have an economy in the UAE that is heavily involved with and penetrated by the Iranians. Yeah. And so when it comes to terrorist financing with groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, I would say the UAE is an excellent partner, and they take very effective steps. When it comes to stopping the sale of petrochemicals, or the purchase of petrochemicals, I should say, from Iran, or some of the other kinds of smuggling activities, maybe there's always,
because of the free zones, maybe in Jabal Ali. And
free zones are a big issue for the Emirates. Yeah, that's a good example.
Maybe this is a good step also to what is the role of UAE convincing Iran to go back a normal country, for example? If we hope so, it can be realized.
Well, I'm not sure that the mullahs in Tehran can be convinced of such a thing. And make no mistake about it, the Iranians want to see an end to every one of the GCC countries' governments, and they actively conspire, particularly in the case of Bahrain. We see active Iranian plots to try to topple the governments there.
And attacking Mecca and Medina, and
the Iranians are no friends of the Gulf Arab nations. And I think this is well understood by all of the GCC countries, but it is complex, and the UAE in particular sits literally there, right across the Gulf from the Iranians and their missiles, and so these are matters that they are very concerned with.
Mm-hmm. During your distinguished tenure in government, did Russia and Europe cooperate or help in tracking down terror financing somehow?
So, two different issues, the Russians, and so if we talk about the Russians, I would say my relationship with the Russians on this was good. The Russians have been victims of terror attacks, particularly those coming out of Chechnya. So they do very much understand this threat, and they are, when they choose to be, they're highly effective. I would say the relationship with the Russians on proliferation finance, which sometimes is connected to terrorist financing when you talk about ballistic missiles and these kinds of things, maybe less as effective a relationship. Always room for improvement. Europe is a different matter because Europe obviously is comprised of many different countries with many different legal structures and frameworks for how they fight against terrorist financing. But I would say overall the relationship with nearly every European country was very good.
Mm-hmm. Which most European country was damaged by terror financing scams or something?
Well, they've all, not all of them, but many of them have suffered. You've seen terror attacks and multiple terror attacks in London. In fact, the killing of the member of Parliament, which looks to be a terrorist attack, just 2 days ago. You had the bombings after 9/11. You had 3/11 in Madrid with the subway attacks that killed many and horribly wounded hundreds. You've had terror attacks in Turkey. You've had them in Italy, Germany. So France, we had horrible events in France. So I would say many of our NATO allies and our European friends very much understand this threat, and they work very closely with the U.S. On it.
About Lebanon supporting the Lebanese army, is it a kind of fighting terrorism, fighting Hezbollah, and that can be considered as an interference, American interference in Lebanese politics?
Absolutely not. The United States does not interfere in Lebanon. That's something that Hassan Nasrallah wants people to believe. The fact of the matter is that there is a country that interferes daily in Lebanese affairs, and it's Iran. And they do it through their puppet, Hassan Nasrallah. And so I would say from the U.S. perspective, we have multiple interests in Lebanon. First and foremost, there's a cultural interest that we have as a country, because there is a huge Lebanese American community here in the United States, very active and very committed to Lebanon, and that is a key element of how we look at the country. But secondly, we are committed to supporting democracies and free market economies around the world. Unfortunately, because Hezbollah has systematically grown in strength as they have been able to maneuver through the very divided and corrupt Lebanese political system, we've seen the economy in Lebanon collapse. The banking system is in a severe situation. That used to be one of the two so-called pillars of stability in Lebanon. One was the LAF, and the other was the banking system. We seem to have lost the banking system. And so support for the LAF as the only legitimate military organization. Hezbollah is not a legitimate military organization. And frankly, the LAF needs to do more to stop the kinds of activities like the effort that was just undertaken to through force and intimidation to try to stop the Beirut port bombing or the explosion in the Beirut port.
It seems that they are responsible, but they think that this is it's like a conspiracy idea from U.S. and the West.
It's clear. If there were ever any question that Hezbollah was somehow complicit in the ammonium nitrate warehouse, I think the recent efforts that they took to try through force and intimidation to try to stop that investigation makes clear their role.
Mm-hmm. Dear Ambassador, do you think that now U.S. can be involved not only financially or supporting the Lebanese army, but in other way to stop Hezbollah and stop this Iranian influence? Is there any sign of a civil war coming, and what U.S. will do about it?
I hope not, and I don't think that Hezbollah is on the verge of a civil war. But I will say that the future of Lebanon is in the hands of the Lebanese people. There is this tendency that I found through many trips to Lebanon and working very closely with both the private sector in Lebanon as well as the government. There's this tendency by the Lebanese people to want the U.S. to come in and somehow fix things, or maybe France will come in and fix things. The Lebanese people need to take responsibility for their future, and we need a real reform in the way the government operates, and we need a real end to the corruption. At the heart at the root of all of these problems is corruption. It is absolutely outrageous that that so many billions of dollars have been spent on electricity generation, but people are operating on a few hours of electricity a day right now. And Hezbollah has exploited all of this.
During your work with Trump administration, did you have any information about this corruption? Did you track these politicians during the Treasury job?
Very closely. And we took action. We put sanctions on, for example, under the Magnitsky, the Global Magnitsky Act, which for the U.S. Can be for human rights abuses or for corruption. And in his case, it was for corruption.
Your Excellency, you were a high-ranking official in the Treasury Department. How did you report the White House, and are you a part of the National Security Council or what is known as an SC process?
So Secretary Mnuchin was the Treasury Secretary at the time, and he was a member of the National Security Council and a very close advisor to the President on all of these topics and issues. As his Assistant Secretary, I participated almost daily in the work of the National Security Council and the staff there on financial crimes and terrorist financing issues around the world, across every single geography. And so both myself and my team were very much part of that process and heavily involved.
I thank you so much, Ambassador Marshall Billingslea. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being with us.
It's great to be with you. Thanks again.
Hey, Maria Malouf here. Please click to like and subscribe to Maria Malouf TV YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.